Welcome back to my 2022 NFL Exit Report series. Today's a good one. Today we have the New York Giants, a really surprising team in 2022. And even better than that, we've got a special guest on here. We've got Chris Farley, he's a very busy guy, so I appreciate that he's on here today. The head of betting for the 33rd team, New York Giant fan, and very successful in the NFL and NBA. Welcome, Chris. How are you?
Thanks so much, Ron. Very few people in this industry that I look up to more than you. Just over the years, because I've come to know you. We've had some conversations just about the way you prepare. I think a lot of us can learn from that. And we were talking before the show about how much I took on this fall. Especially with the NBA. I mean, you mix in NBA and college basketball, but even just the NBA, it's like there's a lot of madness that happens, especially at the start of the season, which is prime football season. So maybe I navigate that a little bit differently next year. But absolute pleasure to be on the show with you, Ron, and looking forward to talking some Giants football. Not bad in 2022.
Not bad at all. One more thing before we get into the Giants season. Tell me a little bit more about the 33rd team, because that hasn't been around that much. How did you get going with that?
I appreciate that. I think my fifth place circle win in 2021 had something to do with it. Kind of put you on the radar a little bit of, handicappers who tangibly succeed at something, right? And I think there was probably a good bit of luck last season in 2021 when we got that circle win, but I think that just put me on the radar of some folks, and then got a DM last summer from their content director, and it's a great team. It's a great website. I mean, they're obviously completely, fully, 1,000% invested in everything football. It's not going to slow down in the offseason too. We're going to, study the draft, study what these teams should do in the offseason, at least from our perspective, maybe what some of their downfalls are. You're already getting the ball rolling here, Ron, and we've got obviously quite a few months to tackle all these teams. But yeah, the 33rd team led by two previous NFL presidents. They incorporate former NFL players, coaches. Very, very cool. I mean, the fact that I get to sit on a show with Tank Williams, former, Stanford defensive player, and then NFL player for 7 years, it's just really cool, Ron. So still kind of pinching myself about that, and hoping my career is long with them as well, because football has always been, as much as I love to bet the NBA too, and I've had some success, football is my love, and even though I'm feeling some respite now, I'm sure in a few days I'm going to be like, man, I missed the NFL already, so
Oh, no. I need a break. Sorry.
So it's a great enterprise, and I think it's only growing. So I appreciate you mentioning that. They've treated me well, and it's a classy organization, and they got some smart people over there.
Great. Let's talk New York Giants. And a year ago at this time, maybe even 13 months ago at this time, my impression of the New York Giants, I can't help but think back to that 17th game. Quarterback sneak, punt. The coaching staff said, well, we just wanted to give more room for the punter. They had 4 wins on the year. There was nothing to lose, and they're playing defensive football in the 17th game of the season. Time to get rid of the GM, the coach, and everything. And so now we think back to what transpired in February, March, and so on. Chris, talk about the changes that they made at all of these positions: GM, head coach, offensive, defensive coordinator, all from winning programs.
Yeah, absolutely. Kafka, offensive coordinator, right? They got Don Wink Martindale on defense, which, all these guys, I think, and especially Brian Daboll, and you could say the same thing about Joe Schoen. I mean, all these guys are culture setters. They've had experiences with great organizations, and I think you learn what makes a great organization work, just like anything else, right? If you're in IT, it doesn't matter what business sector you're in. If you are under the tutelage of great organizations and leadership and successful organizations, you can then copy that, right? Because essentially that's all we're doing. That's all anyone's doing is, we're copying what others have done before us, and trying to make it our own. And that really starts with Brian Daboll. Had the experience at Alabama, obviously pretty good organization there. Obviously had the experience with the Buffalo Bills as well in their offensive coordinator position, which I think he probably made a difference not being on the Bills this year. I'm not saying that there's a
Yeah.
direct correlation between Josh Allen's mistake prone tendencies necessarily, but I think Dayball brings out the best in quarterbacks. So I think we have a front office that's there to stay for quite a long time because they've been doing things that the Giants faithful have been waiting for, right? They are changing the style of play to suit the quarterback instead of just like, I guess, forcing the administration that they want that doesn't really fit, right? We're seeing their defense that's really under talented in a lot of ways, overperform, play really hard. And great schemes from Don McMartindale, who we know is a pretty aggressive play caller as well. But that sort of thing, these culture setters, they set a standard within the organization, and they have a standard from a record of success. And I think that's a big change for any organization. I expect the same thing from the Broncos this year, right? Sean Payton's going to come in there and he's going
Yeah.
to be the adult.
Sure.
He's going to be the
Yeah.
dad in the room. Like it's not going to be Russell Wilson anymore. And it probably shouldn't have been from the very beginning. So yeah, I trust that this Giants organization have figured things out now. Definitely was skeptical about previous hirings, but I do think that over the next, I'll say 5 to 10 years, and maybe even because we saw immediate obvious difference this year, 3 to 5 years maybe really competitive, maybe 5 to 10, we'll see. Maybe an elite organization eventually, because there's a lot of staying power. This is a young administration too, for the most part. So it's exciting, Ron, and that's what I'm happy about, right? I knew the Giants weren't going to beat the Eagles probably. I knew they probably weren't going to get it even as far as they did. But at least we know that there's a future that we can get excited about.
Yeah, you mentioned culture change, and I had those words penned in, and it didn't stop with free agency. Having covered the draft for 40 years, this was a pleasant surprise to see the Giants at near the top of my food chain in the draft. I'm going to throw out numbers that people probably don't know about this last draft. 9 of their 11 picks, 11, by the way, is really good too. 9 of their 11 picks, Power Five conferences. The only two that weren't were from San Diego State, perennial bowl team, and Cincinnati, moving to a Power Five conference. What did they do? Lose 1 or 2 games in the last 2 years. Every one of their 11 draft picks has tasted a bowl game or 2 or 3. Real culture change in the organization. Speak to a guy like Thibodeau, who was drafted early. I thought he needed to go to the right coaching staff and right team. I was worried about him going into the NFL and his work ethic, but he went to the right organization all of a sudden.
I agree, and you could see the growth in him. Even though he started later in the season, it seemed like he got better every single week. He had some games where I don't know off the top of my head, but we're talking 5+ tackles, a sack, a quarterback hurry, active. And speaking to what you're saying, right? He's a big personality, so you're like, is this guy going to be consistently invested in football, or is he one of these dramatic personalities? But you saw, and I do give credit to the coaching staff too, because let's face it, he's a 22-year-old kid. You saw
Right.
him chase down plays, right? Get up off the ground, keep on going. You saw that from a lot of defensive players this year, which the Giants needed because they weren't overly talented. But I do think, not to jump into positional units necessarily, if you want to get to that point, but I do think that the Giants defensive line could be, I think they're a fringe top 10 unit right now, and I think they could be a top 5 unit in the years to come. For the most part, they're young, right? I got it written down here somewhere, but Leonard Williams, 28, Dexter Lawrence, a young 25, right? And then you got Thibodeau, 22. So a lot of room to grow there and get even better. And they were game wreckers in a few games.
Yeah, it's a feel good spot. Defensive line, one of their strengths for sure. At this point, I usually go over. I have a team sheet that I populate in July and August. The process is such that I don't want to overreact during the year. I want to have things, honed in, what my expectations are in July and August when they get to a certain game and a certain point. And I write down seasonal keys. So I'm going to read off these keys to you, and then you can add your own or respond to some of these. Key number 1, Will Barkley be back to 100%? He was 3.7 per carry in 2021, 4 total TDs. That was a question for me. Key number 2, the martingale effect. At the time, I have to be honest, I kind of wanted Vic Fangio instead of Martindale because I was worried that the talent that he had, they wouldn't be able to cover as much if the blitz didn't get through and stuff like that. Now, in hindsight, Martindale did very well, but at the time, that was a key for me. Third of 4 keys, they actually seemed weaker to me in the secondary to start the season. Bradbury goes to a rival team, obviously Philadelphia. We saw what happened with them. Were the Giants good enough in the secondary? And then the 4th key, we know how it played out, but basically we all had questions about Daniel Jones starting the season. A lot of turnovers. What did he add to the unit? What can this coaching staff do? Those were my 4 keys coming into the year. Comments, questions, additions, what do you got?
Could you give me the first one again? What was the
First one was is Barkley. Is he back to 100%?
Barkley, and I know Saquon really wants to stay with this team, so we'll see what happens in the offseason. But he certainly seems like he's back to 100%, Ron. I mean, we saw Saquon making the same kind of plays that he made at Penn State. Just like multiple spin moves on certain plays. But I would say too, he's playing a little bit smarter as well. A lot of these guys who are super explosive, saw the same thing from Odell Beckham when he was first on the Giants. The cuts they make and the pressure that they put on their body in games sometimes is a little much. Like I think Saquon learned that, like, even though I'm obviously extremely talented, I need to navigate and play a little smarter too. Follow my blockers, not try to be a hero all the time. And to the Giants' credit and their offensive line, especially in the run game, right? They're one of the top running units in the NFL this year. They played really well, and Saquon hasn't had an offensive line really to play behind, or at least not a cohesive one. We have a true potential star in Andrew Thomas. Evan Neal is young. I think he's probably going to get better. Some of the other guys are questionable, but at least Saquon, he had some holes. The scheming was good. You put a player like that in a good scheme, right, with a smart coach. Dangerous player. So I hope the Giants can be able to hang on to him in this offseason. Key number 2, was that Martindale?
No, that was Martindale. That was Martindale and then Bradbury. They kind of go hand in hand because they're defensive keys.
Yeah, absolutely. So with Martindale, I totally agree with you. I was really concerned that he was going to bring these heavy blitzing schemes. And then when they didn't work out, the Giants were going to get, cooked. And I do think that we saw that a little bit this year. Against defenses that, according to my power ratings, are either like mediocre, mid-range, or below average offenses, the Giants allowed only 16 points per game. So they can scheme their way, and they have enough talent. Players like Julian Love played really well this year. It kind of came onto the scene surprisingly, and made some big plays. But they allowed 16 points per game against offenses like that, Ron. But against the 6 offenses that I would argue were much better, right? Like kind of similar to the Eagles' schedule, right? Haven't seen a lot of them this year. Dallas, Philly, Lions, and Vikings, 6 games, 30 points per game allowed. So, I think Wink Martindale I think he's a solid coach, and I think the fact that he's building up, they have a defensive line that's improving is the most important thing, right? Because now if they can get pressure just with that defensive line and maybe one other guy, now that changes things for the Giants defense a little bit. And I think Don is going to have more faith in that moving forward. Early in the year, that was a challenge. But I think when there's true matchup advantages for an offense, where like the Eagles are almost a matchup, I mean, they have matchup advantages against almost anybody with their offense, especially with that offensive line, right? It's not fair, and I don't think they're even close to that point where they can compete defensively with those types of offenses. But I think it's getting better, and I would certainly love to see some extra talent there in the secondary, because I think these guys we have a lot of like C+, B players, not a lot of like A- even, right? So some work needs there, but I think Don did about as much as he could.
Yeah. No, and these are all points, and we'll bring them up again when we look forward to what's coming for 2023. So season win decisions, for me, I said they were 1 year away. I said, no, they can't compete right now. I know the NFC's going into the season was perceived to have a fairly easy schedule. As it turned out, the NFC East were dominated a couple of other divisions instead. Did you do anything at all with division futures, anything related to the New York Giants?
I didn't, even though I wanted to. I really wanted to take. I wanted to take the Giants win total over because I did believe in Dayball. There was just something different about this administration, and when you can't quantify it, like put your finger on
Yeah.
it, tough to pull the trigger on the wager. But I did think that they were going to finally have at some point like a winning record this season, and you were just going to see some real changes. So no bets for me. And I would dare say next year I'm even more concerned, I'm probably even more hesitant to take that bet because the schedule will be harder, right? So,
Yeah.
and now the Giants were also a playoff team that beat a team in the playoffs. So I'm not, there's not necessarily a target on their back, but I think teams know that they can be really competitive. So I don't think, I mean, they were the best ATS team in the NFL this year. I don't think that's going to be the case next season.
Yeah. You can do this for a lot of years like I have, and how many years that you've done it and so on, and still learn things. The term addition by subtraction. I mean, I saw it with Urban Meyer and didn't pull the trigger with Jacksonville, and may be the case here because what the coaches did was really amazing. So they blast out of the gate. I mean, I look at week one, and I know you could overreact to week one. I say it all the time. There are some teams that win the first game and they don't win again. I mean, there's crazy results because of the way people treat the preseason. Some people don't even let their guys see the locker room if you're the Rams or the Chargers or some of these other teams. The Giants, Barkley runs for, what did he run for? 164 yards first week. Daniel Jones completes 17 of 21 passes. I didn't see that coming. And then they're beating Baltimore. They're beating Green Bay. They're beating all these teams. What were your impressions during this incredible early streak, which means you get buy-in from players with the new coaches?
Yeah, I was I was really surprised that I think the point that I became like, oh wow, this is a Giants team that could actually win some games against pretty good teams was that game in England against the Packers. Because first of all, they were down in the first half, right? Like the Giants don't really play
Mhm.
well from behind. They don't really have an offense built that way. But they came out in the second half, and we heard Payne and Eli talk down about adjustments at um, halftime, but probably less about adjustments, but more about that culture that we're talking about, right? Like in seasons past, a lot of these players, Daniel Jones, Saquon Barkley, Sterling Shepard, a lot of the fundamental pieces that they've had for a few seasons, these are disciplined guys who definitely want to win and put in the work. I mean, that's what everything said, right?
Yeah.
So you put in an administration in there that can actually teach them and guide them and set them up for success. And all of a sudden, they're more ready than you think.
Mhm.
There's not a lot of egos on the Giants. There's not a lot of troublemakers. I thought maybe it could be a Kayvon Thibodeau, but even him, right? So I think it's just as a team, the Giants prove that um, they can be a better team than a lot of teams in the NFL because of the way they're coached, because of how well prepared they are, and because they have an identity. I wrote an
Mhm.
article about that at the 33rd team this year. At the time, the Titans were one of those teams too, winning games that that people didn't expect. The Giants have an identity now, and that's something that they
Mhm.
haven't had for a long time. And they stick to that run first operation, try hard on defense and mix things up a little bit creatively on both ends. And all of a sudden, you have a Giants team that believes in themselves, right? So I hate to always go back to that, but I do think that the biggest change is the administration itself and how the team felt like they were being guided by like a dad in the room, like an adult in the room, for across the aisle, Kafka, Martindale, and Brian Dayball. They have a unitive bunch now, and I think a
Mhm.
lot of teams don't have that, right? Like you look at a team like the Green Bay Packers at that point in the season, especially, like things were up and down, right? Like the Giants have that intangible sort of above a lot of other teams already.
Yeah.
So now they bring some more talent, and now we're really talking.
Yeah, it's kind of, you mentioned Denver before, but this could have been Denver if they bought into the program. But the coaching decisions and the botch stuff that happened
Yeah,
in Denver didn't happen for the first time in years with the New York Giants. So
yeah,
what a
right.
confidence builder for them. And the dynamic with Wink Martindale facing his old team Baltimore and getting a whole bunch of points at home, that was a good spot. I love that spot. But I still saw warning signs at this particular time. That's what the banner shows at the bottom. And I faded them against Seattle. And one of the reasons is, and I wonder whether this happened with you as well. As the Giants were winning, their power number wasn't really moving up for me. It
Hmm.
was just barely, yeah, they were winning, they were getting a little bit higher, but they didn't enter any uncharted territory for them. They were just kind of winning. Uh, what was going on with your power ratings, if you remember, and were there warning signs at 6-1 for you?
Yeah, that's such a good question. Yeah, at that point, I was along the same level as you. Like, I really wanted, to bump them up, but something wasn't jumping off the page enough, I think, right? Like, you didn't
Mhm.
see explosive plays necessarily. You didn't see necessarily big plays from their defense either. This is just a
Mhm.
team that doesn't make mistakes, and that's a huge culture change, right? I mean, the Giants of the
Yeah.
past, look at Daniel Jones, could not take care of the football at all. And he was, I
Mhm.
believe his attempt to interception ratio was the best in the NFL this year. So he it just had a huge change in his style of play and protecting the football. But that's kind of how the Giants were winning games, right? And then all of a sudden, I remember that Seattle spot was a really tough road spot. I think it was their third straight week on the road. Or just like, they came from England and they went down to Jacksonville and then they went to
Yeah.
Seattle. So it was tough. And then, you started to see the dog days of their schedule were starting to come because the first half, very winnable. Second half, okay, here starts, Dallas, Washington. They haven't faced Philly yet, right?
Mhm.
They had Minnesota there in the back half as well. So it was looming, and I knew that. I think the Giants might get a little more exposed against some of these matchup advantages that other teams are going to have because at the end of the day, offensive line at that point, defensive line, without Kayvon Thibodeau wasn't as consistent. Really, in any positional unit, a lot of
Mhm.
teams would out talent the Giants, and I thought that was going to catch up to them, right? And then
Yeah.
you saw, even in a bad spot against a team like Seattle that was surging at the time, they just couldn't pick themselves up. So, I mean, I think again, the Giants are going to be that team that can continue to surprise teams and hang in games and compete just because they're a great team. But
Mhm.
there's a limit to that.
Yeah, fantastic points there. Yeah, for me, it was 13 defensive sacks, 20 sacks allowed. They weren't just quite riding the ship. They just looked like a 6-1 team that was more like 3-4, 4-3, but getting they were getting everything, maximum effort out of the coaching staff. Down the stretch, an interesting game, 2020 tie with Washington, which I thought was a blessing for them. I thought it practically knocked Washington out of the race based on they were a game ahead of them. Maybe their dreams of winning the division, which probably weren't going to happen anyway with Philly still there in Philly with one loss at the time and
Yeah.
stuff like that. But their dreams of making the playoff, I think, were saved and enhanced by that 2020 tie. And they were competitive against a similar team that was overperforming Minnesota. They looked and belonged. They had that feel of a playoff team at that particular time. Um, they finished with a 25-27 sack ratio after that 13-20. So they were actually looking better, even though their record wasn't looking as good. Had to feel good, or did you feel good about the way they closed the regular season?
I really did because I did see a different gear from the team in general. Like, okay, like, yeah, we have had a good season, but if we want to make the playoffs, we got to hit a different gear here a little bit.
Mhm.
And I think, one of the main reasons as to why they were able to at least win a few of those games was Daniel Jones. Daniel Jones, although, and I'm sure we're going to talk about him a little bit more. He's a pretty main talking point with the Giants. But he did what he had to do at that point in the year, and he still was not turning over the football. Showed great leadership, especially like in those games against the Vikings. I know they lost the first one, but they were right there. And again, it's the Vikings, but the Giants were proving that, through Daniel Jones kind of leading them in the run game, and then again, their defense their defense got healthier too. Kayvon was in the lineup. They got some extra things at the end that I think teams didn't see coming. And, they capitalized on all those things too. You also saw a group of wide receivers that now that, even though they were kind of backups, right, now they're playing with each other a little bit more, right? You saw them, these guys that maybe nobody really thought about, they're out there on the field game in and game out, right? So now they have some chemistry, right? Like now they start to believe in themselves. That's going to work really well for the Giants in the future too, because a player like Hodgkins, maybe he's not going to be a starter, right? But like he's a seasoned backup now, right? So the Giants can hang on to players like that, maybe bring in again more talent. Again, I got to go back to Dayball because I feel like he just continued to extract the best version of the Giants, and he knew when to maybe like apply some more of that motivation at that point in the season, right? Like at the beginning of the season, you're playing with house money, nobody expects you to do anything, you're winning. Okay, now there's pressure, so this is different, and it just speaks to the way that he guided this team, and you can see it on the sidelines too. There was a pass, I think it was in their game against the Vikings in the playoffs, where Slayton dropped the ball, and it could have been a game-changing pass. But the way that Dayball came up to Slayton after that play, talked him through it, gave him confidence, like that. Nowadays, especially a coach like that is what these players need. Like the Bill Parcells era is kind of over.
Gone, yeah.
Yeah, and I think he's just the perfect personality, to really guide these young players who, they're sensitive. I mean, this is a tough era to play football with social media and everything.
Oh yeah, yeah. I thought he brought a grounded attitude to them. I'm glad you brought up the wide receivers because I had forgotten to. So we're thinking along the same lines and stuff. Slayton, except for that one drop, and Hodgkins, who I do know very well because that was my school in college, Oregon State University. So these guys didn't drop any passes in clutch time, and they were there. They did everything asked of them. And maybe it's not a star wide receiver group. I mean, their star was overpaid and he had played like 5 games a year or something, Galladay, but they really got the job done. So they beat Minnesota. Great effort, great showing there. And there were some situational factors that weren't in their favor against Philadelphia. And it didn't look good, but hey, 9 wins in the regular season, 10 wins overall. Incredible job. And now it's time to look forward, okay? There's a lot of decisions to make. We're at the close of the season. Great year by Daniel Jones, 5 total interceptions. Barkley, 10 running touchdowns. So he answered my seasonal keys that we talked about. They met every one of them. It was an incredible year, but in order to get better, in order to stay the same, you would really have to get better because, like you mentioned, the schedule ramps up. They're not going to sneak up on anybody anymore and all that. So moving forward, let's tackle Daniel Jones first. What kind of contract do you give him?
Yeah, I've heard a lot of talk about this, like mid-tier quarterback, like a new mid-tier quarterback contract, right?
Yeah.
Which is interesting, because it doesn't seem to happen very often. I mean, I kind of like that idea. You bring him in like a 40 mil, 2 year, 3 years, I don't know. And here's the thing: Dayball and Joe Shane, they said that they want to keep Daniel. And why wouldn't they? The guy has done everything right for them this year. Apparently he's the first one to show up every morning. And clearly he has the capacity to lead a team to win. And he's very gifted with his running ability. And when I definitely saw some improvements in his passing game. My issue with Daniel Jones, some of it is a lack of talent around him for sure. But situationally, like what we just saw from Jalen Hurts in the Super Bowl, I was expecting Jalen Hurts to not play very well. I mean, he's 24 years old, Ron. This is not many 24-year-olds show up and play mistake-free football. And of course, he had that fumble, right? But Jalen Hurts clearly has a mentality fit to lead a team. Daniel Jones, I've seen him as a Giants fan freeze up in a lot of situations in games. And We're talking about pressure on him. We're talking about, maybe his guys are covered really well. So the confidence to fit the ball in there and to not overthink, you know, quick decision making doesn't really happen that often in situations like this, like that, where there's a lot of pressure on him. And I think at a certain point, the Giants are going to have to say, okay, Daniel Jones can get us to the playoffs. Daniel Jones is someone we want to keep in the organization, but I don't think that means we have to just settle. It feels like a
Mhm.
relationship a little bit, right? Like we
Yeah.
know when we're settling, we know when we're not completely happy, and I think that's where the Giants are. Like Daniel Jones is that partner who's he's good looking, he's really nice, he'll cook for you, do a lot of things, and then
Yeah.
at the end of the day, something's not hitting. Like we're
Yeah.
not that motivated about the next meetup with that partner, and that's kind of what it is for the Giants right now. I think, that I don't know if Dayball can look at a camera straight face and say, Daniel Jones can take us to a Super Bowl,
Yeah.
because at the end of the day, like we just saw with Patrick Mahomes, you got to throw the football at a level that only a few people on earth can do when you make it to the Super Bowl. And I don't know if Daniel Jones is quite there.
It's a weekly discussion that Las Vegas Chris had with me. I mean, every week. And then Ted on our Friday shows, we talked about, okay, do you sign him? They're critiquing him week after week after week. One of the things I noticed at Duke that I was hoping was going to change, and it gets into what other positions do they need, because they did allow 49 sacks this past year, and that's been a problem, getting that cohesive offensive line that you said is getting there, but not quite there yet. But part of that was Daniel Jones' internal clock, which I didn't like at Duke. I certainly worried about it with the old regime, the old coaching staff, which wasn't going to get his best stuff. Can he improve his internal clock? Have we seen the ceiling of Daniel Jones, or is this just the beginning? But because the staff has just had 1 year to go with him. So I think they need to go offensive line. And I think, like you touched upon, they need to go with the secondary and beef up, get a little bit more star talent in the secondary. Any thoughts on that and any other positions as we close this out that you would look at for the Giants moving forward?
Yeah, well, first of all, I just want to say I think it's a great point you made about the internal clock. Again, of course, I'm using the best player in football as my example consistently here,
Yeah.
but Patrick Mahomes, the reason why the Eagles didn't get a sack, yeah, it's because the Chiefs' offensive line, but nobody moves like that dude in the pocket. Like he has such a great sense. So did Tom Brady, right?
Yeah.
And that's what I don't see from Daniel. Like he doesn't have a sense, Ron. Like there's a
Yeah.
guy coming full speed at him and he's standing there, and I'm like, what do we? So that's a big liability. Yeah, for me, totally agree. Offensive line is what needs to be the number one focus, especially if you're counting on Daniel Jones starting next year for the New York Giants, right? The recipe to make the Super Bowl, like the Eagles did, a run first operation with a quarterback that's intelligent enough and that's disciplined enough to work within the system and make the throws when he needs to. And I think Daniel Jones can do all those things. You have a really high level offensive line, you can get far. So that would be number one. If they don't have that, and that, like what the Eagles just created offensive line wise, is one of the best we've ever seen. So like
Mhm.
that doesn't, usually quarterback passing the football is what gets you to a Super Bowl. I mean, it's, especially these days in the NFL. So
Yeah.
that just seems far reaching for me. So they need to improve the offensive line, but I still don't trust that, just like making it a run first operation is going to solve everything. Secondary for sure. They, again, it's kind of like these, like Isaiah Hodgkins and those guys. They got good guys in the secondary now who want to stay there, who want to work hard. They would be excellent backups. Excellent.
Mhm.
But they don't have a star there. They don't have somebody who like offenses are going to want to avoid. Linebacking crew has always been a weakness. I mean, the Giants just let tight ends do whatever they want. They let
Yeah.
the middle of the field is almost always wide open against the Giants. It has been for years. They got better this year. Brought in some veterans, but I think they still need to shore that up. And I would like the Giants to have one big target at wide receiver that can, take advantage of those 50-50 balls. And I know that was going to be Kenny Galladay, or supposed to be. Even Kenny Galladay, you saw him at the end of the season make some plays, right? Like showing that he's, a part of the, a part of the team, which was nice. But the Giants haven't had that. Like they haven't had that
Yeah,
guy for a while now. It's been Sterling Shepard and Odell Beckham in the past. And as great as Odell is, he's still not that big target, right? That you can,
right.
like an AJ Brown or something. So I would love to see that from the Giants. I think that could save Daniel in some of those situations if he could just loft it up there and at least give his receivers, give his team a chance to get a first down when that internal clock is not working very well.
Yeah.
At least he can just loft it right up, right? So those would be the key additions to me. But like I said, as like a summation, I mean, the Giants at least have the organizational structure set, and it's you want to believe that the coaches of your team are smarter than you, and
Yeah.
I mean, I questioned that, Ron, in some, situations, because like I don't know what they were doing, right? Like you spoke about week 17 last year and how they were punting the ball, like not trying anything, aggressive whatsoever. Now this is an administration I can trust. So that alone has me excited.
What a difference a year make. Just tremendous optimism. I'm with you. I don't know moving forward if we're all guns a blazing. Yeah, season win over. They're going to win the division. Philly's still more talented. Dallas, when they play their best, they're a top five. When they when they're erratic, they're bottom five. I mean,
Yeah.
you don't know about that particular team as we saw in their last games. And Washington is an interesting team and in the mix as well. So we don't know about the Giants, but we do know we like what we saw in 2022. Chris, I really appreciate you giving up a lot of your very busy time. I know the NFL has ended, but the NBA is
It
still
better.
going, and it's been a whirlwind 2 weeks and everything. Thank you so much for joining me here.
Ron, I would love to have you on my podcast sometime and talk some bad. I mean, are you strictly football focused at this point?
I'm strictly football.
Okay,
Yeah,
then
so
I gotta
sorry
bring.
about that. But
That's okay.
if you got draft talk coming up,
Yeah,
I'm interested.
I got to bring you on for some off-season content then. And seriously, I know I say this kind of thing a lot, but I really mean it. It's an honor to talk to, because
Yeah,
this is a man, Ron. Where am I pointing here? Who has been in this industry forever, and just like knows the way to approach it, and I just so appreciate you having me and appreciating me to be on the show with you, Ron.
yeah.
So we'll come back anytime.
Yeah, no, thank you. It is a process. There are no quick fixes. There are no great keys to unlock for the riches unless you do the work. You do the work. It's a grind, but it's a fun grind all the way through. That's the New York Giants in a nutshell for this show. Next, I'll be back with another really interesting team, a former trade partner of the New York Giants, the Chicago Bears, as we continue down the NFC. So thanks for everybody for watching, and we'll see you again down the road.